welcome to a long-awaited conversation that was recorded back in 2022. Yet it is being released only now due to its sensitive nature. Our guest is Daniel M. Stuart, a scholar specializing in South Asian religions, literary cultures, and meditation traditions, focusing on the Buddhist tradition's texts and practices. This episode centers on the renowned meditation teacher S.N. Goenka. For those interested in exploring more of the points being shared in this conversation today, we recommend his 2020 book, Emissary of Insight. Additionally, during the discussion that follows, we refer to an unpublished draft which, I'm happy to say, has since been published and is available for one and all to read. You can find it under the title Insight in Perspective, S.N. Goenka and the Emergence of Global Insight Meditation and Mindfulness. We definitely encourage listeners who are interested in the topic to explore both of these valuable resources. With that, we hope you enjoy this conversation, which marks the first in a series discussing this significant subject. I'm really pleased to be joined here by Daniel Stuart on today's episode of Insight Myanmar podcast. Dan, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here, Joa.
So Dan happens to be the person who gave me my first ever Burmese Lungji. This was at a Vipassanā Center in Thailand about 2 decades ago. And after which you encouraged me to take my first trip to Myanmar, which I did just days later. So our stories are quite closely linked. Like me, you also became a serious Vipassana student of S.N. Goenka at a young age. You went on to become a scholar in Buddhist studies. But more than that, and relevant to this discussion, you've spent decades writing a biography of Goenka. A shorter version of this work was published with the title a couple years ago, S.N. Goenka, Emissary of Insight, although there's far more material that has yet to be published. You very kindly shared with me this unreleased draft of a work in progress, which I have to say, honestly speaking, represents the work that I've been waiting as a meditator to read all my life, and at least ever since I took my first Goenka Vipassana course. We've been talking privately about your work for years, and although it's not released in any form yet for the public, I've been encouraging you to find some way of bringing this knowledge out so that other readers, or in this case, listeners, might be able to benefit as I have. Uh, Even though the writing isn't out anytime soon, you've generously agreed to join this podcast episode where we can begin discussing some of the topics of your research and findings. There are few interviews I've done that I've anticipated like this one, and I really thank you for trusting the platform enough to come on and speak openly about a topic which I know can be quite challenging and sensitive to address publicly, as we'll get into later. But in any case, before we get into your research, can you share a bit about how you came to be a meditator in the first place some decades ago?
Yeah, well, thanks for your positive anticipation of our conversation. Yeah, I started meditation Like you said, at a fairly young age, I got into Vipassana in 1997, I think. I was 19 and I had traveled to India. And I was really interested in a whole range of Indian traditions that I had read about as a high school student when I sort of going through high school and encountering the angsty emotions of a young man and looking around me in the United States and really not feeling like what I was seeing in the social world around me was something I really wanted to pursue. I was looking for alternative models, alternative social models, and reading about traditional Indian meditation practices, traditional teachings of the Hindu and Buddhist tradition got me excited to explore different models of social life. And I think I was drawn in particular to the renunciant ideal as a young man, sort of disaffected by a lot of the social experiences I had in the United States. So after high school, I kind of decided I would travel to India and see what it was like, some of these traditions that I had been reading about in books. And my father sort of had encouraged me to explore some of these ideas. So after high school, I went and ended up in India, found myself quite depressed in a very intense environment in northern India, traveling around. And right before I had left, some friends of the family had said to me, "Hey, there's this meditation practice, Vipassana. You should try it out. You're going to India. You should check it out." And these were actually people who were assistant teachers in the tradition, students of Goenka. So I found myself in India, kind of depressed, trying to figure out what to do. And I ended up at a Vipassana center in Jaipur. And I did a 10-day course there. And it was, for me, a quite revolutionary experience. It just really changed my perspective. And I think it was the renunciant ideal that sort of drove me to the practice, and in a sense that was driven home to me in the first 10-day course. And then the experience of the course sort of tied all of those things together, and really sort of set me on the path to explore the teachings of the Buddha in their great complexity. Uh, and very early on, I wanted to explore their early teachings, learn Pāli. Um, Living in India for a while, I thought, oh, I could learn Hindi. And these are things that I did end up going on to do as part of my path. But I did end up back in the US after my trip to India, and this was a sort of period of integration where I kind of was working on the practice, continuing to learn about teachings of the Buddha, and living in the United States, trying to explore a normative social world. I went to college for a year in the United States, but it was actually my renunciant ideals did not really fit well with the kind of normative uh, college experience. So after a year, I found an alternative school, an alternative college that allowed me to spend my whole undergraduate um, time in India, basically doing Vipassana, studying Pali and Hindi, and living all around in different places in South and North India. And at that time, I spent about a year at Dhammagiri, the main um, Goenkaji's main meditation center in Maharashtra. So that sort of was a foundation for me, both in practice and education, for my path that sort of bringing together, studying the ancient teachings, the languages, living in India, and also practicing very seriously within um, the SN Goenka tradition, and living at centers and exploring India as a place. So I don't know if that sort of gives a good foundation. I did then go on to graduate school and became a professor of Buddhist studies, and all of
Mhm.
these things for me sort of were tied together.
Sure.
Um, and that's sort of my trajectory. And through that whole process it was sort of like, well, I want to explore the ancient teachings, but I'm also in this particular tradition. And for me, these things are totally tied together. And so I need to understand both the
Mhm.
ancient teachings and the specific lineage that I'm a part of, the values and the traditions as they're being sort of taught now. And I did sort of take India as really the center point, sort of, post colonial India as the sort of place where Goenkaji really built his institution and disseminated his teachings. And so that was a sort of starting point for me. But it also really pushed me to want to understand the Burmese background, because Goenkaji, as anyone who sort of really hangs out and listens to what he's saying, was so devoted to his teacher and was so invested in Burma as a place, as a source, right, for Vipassanā in modernity. And so that became also a real interest, a historical interest for me as part of my practice, learning about the ancient teachings and also learning
Mm.
about the particular lineage I was practicing in. So I don't know if
That's
that
that.
helps some background.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing. I want to go back to what you said in just that very first course and then the year after. So you're a very young man just after high school in India, depressed. It's a chaotic, crazy environment. And actually, I remember this conversation 20 years ago. I remember some more details than you just shared there, if my memory serves me right, of feeling that the course was almost like a refuge for the just the chaos of the world that you were in. And when I think, if I remember correctly, getting to the course and signing up and everything, and then suddenly looking at the discipline and the structure and being like, oh, wait a second, where am I? This was just supposed to be a break from everything else. But somehow after that first course, you just got completely hooked and transformed, as so many people do after their first 10-day course experience, especially those young people still trying to find their way.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's interesting because at least at the time I felt it was more just an extension of sort of things I had already been working on. And so I think it was sort of this sense of like, okay, I've been sort of trying to get into myself in these ways. During high school, I was exploring a lot of different ideas. I really wanted to sort of figure out, kind of what, just what it was about being human, and so in some sense it was this idea on the course. It was like, oh wow, this is a great kind of way to just get deep into myself and look at what's really going on, and help me sort of get deeper into what I felt, at least, the same kinds of things I had sort of started doing already, in the years leading up to my trip to India. And so it was this sense of like, oh wow, this is really just a solid way into this. But I think also one of the things that really got me was, in a sense, the idea that we can't separate sort of an exploration within the self from an actual ethical system. And I think that's sort of one of the things I was really needing, was a sort of ground, because I grew up in a fairly wild and unstable world. And in many ways, I think it was realizing that actually I needed a sort of ground in a more basic social outlook that prioritized ethical action and, positive relationships, not just the renunciation piece. So in a sense, seeing that there
Mm-hmm.
could be a practice that actually brought those two things together. And in many ways, for me, a lot of my own path has been a struggle between kind of what I think is sort of my natural renunciant instinct and sort of antisocial
Mm-hmm.
attitude, and then a real desire to sort of find a balance with a social world. So I do think, in a sense, and I'm not sure I've actually come to I've come to any real resolution, but in some sense, the simple kind of basic model that actually we develop, towards um, knowledge through this process where we build on the foundation of Shila or Sila, right? And then we cultivate ourselves in community, and then we renounce and experience deeper levels of knowledge and wisdom about, you know, the truths of death and these basic things that had been more like the focus of my preoccupation, sort of really fit, and then just the direct experience of that in the course, and really, I think, but I actually think, like, I was sort of the sort of more the deeper side of the kind of wisdom piece had already been working on me, but I needed sort of a grounding ethical model to help me kind of balance out that side of things. And to get that all in one package was sort of quite exciting, but then also to get so deeply into it, like deeply into the self, deeply into the basic experiences, um, really, really was mind blowing. So I went for my second course 10 days or 15 days later, I think. I traveled to South India and found another course, and like right away went for a second course.
Mm-hmm.
So those early courses, I had no real understanding of what the community was really like, what the structure of the institution was like. What I got was Goenkaji telling me this ideal structure,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the ideal structure is really just what the Buddha taught. I mean, it's pretty close to sort of these standard ideal models of of a kind of hierarchically ordered society, with the highest value being renunciation and arhatship, but with the four assemblies and lay people supporting that, and a model that prioritizes, you know, highly ethical communities of good people helping each other all towards the higher spiritual goal of ultimate renunciation. And so, right, that's an ideal perspective, and that sort of got me at the beginning, and that's sort of what I took as my foundation for my own practice. I didn't get that involved in the community, the actual community, you know, for some time. I went back to the U.S. I was in college. I just was practicing on my own and sort of
Mm-hmm.
figuring out how it would all work. It didn't work for me that well to be in college in the United States, so I ended up in India, sort of just doing my own thing, exploring the path. And that's when I sort of got more connected to the actual community, the institutions, going to more courses, living at the Magiri, um, that kind of thing. But actually, even during that time period, much of that time period, I was largely on my own, just sort of studying and practicing meditation,
Mm-hmm.
learning Pāli, learning Hindi. I was really sort of a quite a solitary hermit actually in that
Mm,
time. I meditated a ton. I did a lot of courses, but it was really my own path, to be honest. I didn't get highly involved in the community,
mm.
the Goenka institution. I really had sort of just my own practice, and I was connected to some extent, but I was never sort of fully immersed in the community as institution. The ideal of the community I took, or really as just a larger attitude about an ideal social world, and ideal values that we should bring into every aspect of our lives, is what really sort of got me.
So as you started to get more into the meditation practice, and it wasn't just like, one course or two course that blows you away, and what's going on, and how exciting it is to uncover deeper things within the mind that haven't been experienced before. But then as time goes on, you go deeper into the practice, you understand it more, it becomes more integrated in life, hopefully. And as you said, you're doing more and more solitary meditation on courses and by yourself. In those first few years, what was that experience like when you went beyond just the wow factor and you got deeper into it and things started opening up?
Yeah, for me again, it was really a good fit actually. And when I went and started reading all the teachings of the Buddha and all of this, for me it was just a direct way to bring some of the things I had learned in the practice, to into a historical understanding of the teachings. And I don't know. It's hard. It's hard to know like about fit, because for me, I sort of always had this balance where I very early on started reading all the teachings of the Buddha in translation at first, and then within a few years I started learning Pāli and teaching myself, the languages of the scriptures. And so for me, I sort of always saw the connection between the traditional teachings and then what I was practicing and what I had been taught by Goenkaji. Um, and there were always sort of things that were like, oh, this is interesting. This is like something that's sort of there in the early teachings that is not specifically mentioned, or maybe is interpreted differently. But generally didn't see like huge conflicts personally at the time, because the whole model for me was just like, oh, we're in the modern world, and the whole game is that we live in this space in between like ancient tradition and modernity. And that's in fact it seemed to be what Goenka was doing in the way he taught. um, and so for me, because I was so immersed in the early teachings from very early on, and so immersed in deep practice, that I always found sort of connections and of course contradictions and differences as just part of my practice. And I found that to be sort of a constitutive way to practice,
Mhm.
understanding that you have ideals and then you have the real world.
Right.
But in a sense, for me, the practice as Goenkaji taught it always fit quite well. It just sort
Mhm.
of worked,
Mhm.
and it just worked on me, and I let it do the work.
Mhm.
And I think the kinds of conflicts that I ran into were sort of traditional conflicts of, I have a renunciant value, but I'm living in the world, right?
Mhm.
I'd like to be celibate, but I have sexual desires, things like
Mhm.
that, you know.
Mhm.
Um, these kinds of dynamics that a young man like exploring these traditional ascetic values would be engaging with, and many people do. I think that was sort of those were the kinds of things, and then of course just exploring cultural differences, because these are
Mhm.
very clearly these values that I was immersing myself in and investing myself in were so clearly not my own cultural
Mhm.
values, and those differences were you know quite apparent, and I had obviously sought these values because they were different from many
Mhm.
of the values that I was raised around.
Right.
And so I was looking for something different. At the same time, there was a certain kind of fit with many of the ideals I had grown up with too. And so yeah, it was an interesting time when in those, you get very excited about these new ideas, and you go around talking. I remember talking to my grandmother about my
Mm,
practice, and she's a very, serious Christian, and trying to find connections with,
mm,
know, different religions and different, values and these kinds of things. So many, these are the kinds of things we do, is get excited about
yeah.
ideas, and when we're young and kind of want to explore them. But yeah, I mean, for me, like, the practice just fit. I sort of found myself getting immersed in it more and more. And then there were these different, you know, points of tension that were always being negotiated, um, as part of the practice.
Right. So another thing you had mentioned, and when you started your first course, that it set you on a path of wanting to learn more about the wider context that this tradition was situated in, as well as that lineage itself. And those are two distinct things, and yet, as you mentioned, they certainly have a very important correlation and interaction with one another. But if you look at them distinctly, the interest in the wider historical Buddhist field is are definitely, even someone, me as a lay reader, I know where I can go to read books on the historical Buddha, or the where the teachings began to spread, and went to different Asian countries. As far as trying to understand the lineage of SN Goenka and Goenka himself, as well as the lineage of teachers before him, where to go to learn that information and to understand that is a completely different matter. This is something I can also say a bit about in terms of where my own passions and interest have gone in the past years, and the dearth of information that I found, and the
Yeah.
endeavor to try to understand more. How did you go about that? As you wanted to learn more about the man, the lineage, the tradition, the technique, there's obviously materials printed by the organization itself. But aside from that, where and how did you go to start exploring that?
Right. Yeah. I mean, actually, even, in the early 2000s or late 90s, when I was starting to get into this, even then, even just getting access to the early teachings was much more difficult than it is now. I mean, a huge amount of work and material has come out even in the last 20 years that's made it much easier to understand and, um, think about the teachings of the Buddha, and also just to think about Buddhism as a larger kind of tradition across Asia. Um, so when I was coming up in, practicing Goenka's teachings, it was very hard to know how to figure these things out. So the first thing I did was learn Pali, and start reading as much as I could of the, in translation, the early teachings. And then when I wanted to figure out about the lineage, yeah, there are those basic materials, but not much. So my first thing was I wanted to go to Burma, of course, right? I wanted to go and visit the origin, the place of origin of these teachings. And so I did. In 2000, I participated in one of these yatras, and that was one of my first experiences in Myanmar, and that was just a beautiful experience. Like many people who go to Burma on these pilgrimages, it felt very special. It was a huge community of people participating in it, and that was a really wonderful. And actually, that was I was living in Japan at that time, in '99, and then we went in 2000 with some friends, assistant teachers. I think some friends that we had in common actually in Japan.
Yeah, I
Uh,
remember that.
and so that was definitely a wonderful first exposure to Myanmar, and it really made me want to sort of hang out more. So I actually did go back, I think, very soon after that. In was it maybe January or February of 2000? I went back for. I think in those days you still could only get 1 month.
Right.
visa, and I guess I could have paid and stayed longer, but I went back, and that's when I really started getting interested in Pali. That I was actually exploring at that time, going to study Pali in Burma. Um, so I spent a month. I hung out at the Majoti for a bunch. I, traveled to the north. But I think it was then that I was trying to see if I could go. They had just started this international Theravada Buddhist university in Yangon, and at that time, I think they had as vice chancellor at the beginning of it, Uko Lay was the vice chancellor. And so he had a connection to Goenkaji. He was a student of Sayaji Ubaken. And so I went and met him, I think, in his guest house very near to the International Theravada University there in Yangon, because I was trying to decide whether I would go and study Pali there. And it was just getting going, and it couldn't really figure out whether it was a viable program. But it was a great moment for me just to meet him, because um, he gave me a really strong push. I was just trying to figure out. I was learning Pali on my own. I was trying to figure out what to do. And though I didn't actually end up studying Pali in Burma or staying in Burma, he did at that time say to me, "You know what? I see a lot of people like you come through. Everyone I talk to says, I want to learn Pali, like I'm interested in these things. Um, and no one does it." These students of Goenka, they just carry on. They don't actually learn the teachings.
Mm,
They don't seem to actually be interested. And so he said to me, "Look, I want you to take an aditan um, right now, that you will actually learn Pali and learn the early teachings of the Buddha, and really know what you're talking about." It was an amazing moment,
wow.
actually. And I did. I did it, and I didn't end up at
Hmm.
the International Theravada Buddhist University, and I think it took actually quite a few years for that institution to really develop into anything. Um, but I did take that very seriously, that idea. And so in the next few years, I ended up in India, and I got very serious about studying Pali. And I ended up studying Pali with a Burmese monk in Varanasi. Um, so
Hmm.
actually a student of Unyanisara, who many people now know, who's quite famous.
Hmm.
Um, so that was sort of, the first two visits to Burma were sort of key impetus for me to get really deeply into the traditional early Buddhist teachings. And I always associated it, of course, with the Theravada tradition in Burma, even though, of course, actually these traditions come out of India. And so I had this sort of really nice, lucky opportunity to study these teachings with a Burmese monk in India. So I sort of got the nice
Mm,
uh, all sides of it. So that was my
mm,
sort of
yeah.
early engagement with Burma, but actually it was only a few short trips, so I never really got really fully understood
Hmm.
the Burmese context early on. I really ended up getting
Hmm.
much more into sort of the tradition as an Indian tradition, as a
Right.
historical tradition from India, and living in India for the next 3 or 4 years after that. I really sort of took on my understanding of Buddhism as an Indian tradition, but coming through the Burmese kind of mediation, in a sense.
Right.
So that's sort of like the that's sort of the context in which I was formed,
Hmm.
with my relationship to Burma. So my real interest in the lineage kind of happened in India, looking at the way it was being kind of delivered to the
Hmm.
community there.
Mm,
Um, And I think it was actually a moment in the early 2000s when the issue for me became clear that I needed to sort of sort something out. There was actually a bit of a problem in these relationships, in the difference between the way it was being taught institutionally in India
Mhm.
and the tradition in Burma. And it happened when I was living at Dhammagiri with my brother. My twin brother was with me at that time, and we worked on this short video, a historical video about the Sixth Council in Burma. And it was sort of, we were kind of looking at the different councils, the way the text, the Pāli tradition had been handed down in India, this sort of classic story of the way that the teachings were preserved. They were preserved in India through these councils. They were preserved in Sri Lanka. When they were threatened, they were brought to Burma and Thailand and preserved there. And then there was this key moment, right, in 1954, 1955, when they had this sixth council, the Burmese tradition. They brought a lot of monks from all over the Theravada world, and they recited the texts and preserved them. And that was the sort of modern kind of version of these teachings being preserved. And that's sort of what we were involved in.
Mhm.
Goenka actually brought some of those texts to India, and they were editing them at Magiri and this kind of thing. And so at
Mhm.
that time, we were actually helping create sort of what we might think of as a propaganda video for that story.
Mm.
It was a short history about that story, and we so at that time I was like, oh, we need to really talk about the Sixth Council, look at the details of that historical moment in Burma, really find out all of what was going on. And so we had these images from the Sixth Council in the video, and particularly we had the images of the key recitations that were happening. Um, and there was a respondent, right, and a questioner, and they're reciting these traditional texts in Pali. And in the traditional context in the Sixth Council, there were two key famous monks. One really important monk who's also famous as a meditation teacher, but was also involved in the recitation, was the Mahasi Sayadaw. He was the respondent, I believe,
Mhm.
in many of these key recitation contexts. And so we had images of the Mahasi Sayadaw in the video we had made. Um, and there was this sort of, they're telling the story, and then images of Mahasi Sayadaw, and then images of Burmese monks. And we took this video we had made. We were quite proud of it, my brother and I. We thought, oh, we made this great little thing. It'll be good for all the Vipassana community to watch and learn about this. And we're participating. And, one of Goenkaji's main assistants, we showed it to him, and he said, nope, you can't include the image of Mahasi Sayadaw.
Wow. Really?
and so this was a moment where I was like, oh wait, hold on.
Hmm.
This is strange, right?
Yeah.
What's going on here? And then the other thing he said at that time was, and I have to sort of paraphrase it because it's from memory and a long time ago, but he basically said, they've got a lot of faith in Burma, these Buddhists, but we have the true Dhamma here in India now.
Hmm.
And I thought, wow, this is interesting because I've not been getting this exact message.
Mhm.
Goenkaji's been talking so much about how he's bringing these teachings from Burma and so much
Right.
respect to his teacher in Burma. And so it was a key moment for me early on. This was the early 2000s. It must have been 2002 or something like that. Within this institution in India, right, sort of at the center of Goenkaji's world there at Dhammagiri, where I thought, oh wow, there's something going on here. There's some cultural dynamics.
Hmm.
There's some things, and so that was one of the key moments that began sort of an exploration of first the differences in the traditions in Burma, right, between, say,
Hmm.
someone like the Mahasi Sayadaw and Goenkaji's teacher Uba Khin, right? There's a sort of key lineages that actually, have different approaches to how to teach Vipassana. There's a lot in common, but of course there are key distinctions that were very important, particularly for some of the teachers. And then there's this other thing. An identity of the Dhamma as something that's actually Indian, and that actually in its Burmese version possibly, right, is different in some way. That's certainly not what Goenkaji taught, but it does come through in certain moments, right, in certain
Hmm.
ways, because he's in India and he has to differentiate what he's doing from Buddhism, right? So this moment for me was a key, one of a number of key moments that sort of set me off and made me want to
Hmm.
explore these differences. And in many ways, these differences or looking at and figuring out these differences, which are historical, which are cultural, right, are the source of the kind of work I've now been publishing in the last few years. So it began a long time ago, and it was an exploration of the early teachings, and then all these different historical permutations of the teachings, and then Burmese teachings, um, and so yeah, the kind of materials you've read and the short biography of Goenkaji that I've published, in many ways, sort of the concerns I've had in working on that stuff emerged from those moments in the early 2000s, late 90s in my formation in India and in Burma, and then also living in the United States and connecting with communities there, who are also, deeply involved in the institution, but had their own way of thinking about it and talking about it, often quite divorced, for instance, from what was happening in India and what was happening in Burma. And so, yeah, this sort of constellation of different uh, parts of the community and then different aspects of its history, and my relationship to them sort of fed into my work, my research, my path towards understanding the teachings of the Buddha more broadly as I went to grad school later on and things like that.
What it makes me think of when I hear that is this intersection between the field that one is exploring, the content, and the personal, and the way that one relates to that. And as you're telling this really vivid story of this video that you made, and the response that you received and your reaction to it, I think the really key part of that story is your reaction. From the way you describe it, it sounds like your reaction to hearing that the reason why we need to cut Mahasi Sayadaw out of the video is there's this separation between the technique and practice that Goenkaji was teaching and what everyone else is doing in Burma, Mahasi being a part of everyone else. And it sounds like your reaction was one of curiosity, one of, oh, I want, what's going on here? I want to know more. To just take a minute to talk about my own story and trajectory, I had probably many similar moments like that. I don't really remember one distinct moment, but I definitely had enough of those moments that when I came to Myanmar to live in 2007, to live and to work, I came embedded with certain biases and assumptions that were closing me off to certain kinds of conversations and curiosity, because the response that from the assistant that you were given was completely in line with my own thinking and my own assumptions and unchecked reasoning. And there's, as you told that story, the story that's coming up in my mind is this incident in probably about 2008 or 2009. And I had arranged for a public showing of one of the Goenka videos, the prison videos. It was either doing time, doing Vipassanā or Dhamma Brothers. I don't remember which one. And I showed it to a number of people in the community and monks and everyone else, talking about how Burma had been this kind of incubator for this technique, which then went around the world and I was evidence of someone who had practiced it and the interest that was in it. And one monk came up to me after the session and told me that how much he appreciated the video and my practice and how happy he was. And I said, "Oh, are you also a practitioner in this technique?" And he said, "No, no, I'm not. I practice," and I don't even remember what he said. He could have said Mogok, Mahasi, Sunlun, anything. At that point, it was only Goenka and non-Goenka, and the fact that he told me he was practicing a non-Goenka technique was evidence that that not so much evidence was a sign that I didn't really need to know more, that I wasn't interested. And I remember, and he started to talk about his practice, and I remember saying to him, and I share this memory because, well, it's something I'm not proud of. It's something I cringe at even having to tell here, but I think it's important because it's indicative of my own journey and my own intersection between the practice that I was carrying in the context where I was living. I told him, I don't want to hear more about this. I said, I don't want to know about these other techniques or practices. I know the one that I'm doing is how the Buddha actually taught, and that I know there's these other techniques here, but those are not things that concern me or I even want to know about. And I would really encourage you to look into, this Goenka tradition and whatever else. And I reflected on that conversation for months and years later with obvious kind of horror, inner horror, that as a Westerner who had not grown up around any Buddhism or monasticism and had dabbled maybe somewhat seriously compared to others, but certainly not any level of that country, had dabbled with courses and practice, and sometime in my life had found this and had been serious, that I was suddenly lecturing a Buddhist monk who had grown up in this environment and dedicated his life to the practice and the robes, to lecture him on the superiority of my practice and background and encourage him to look into that. And as I went on further in living in Myanmar, that incident played a greater outsized role of the kind of person I didn't want to be and the kind of meditator I didn't want to be, and played a role in eventually starting to open me up and develop greater curiosity and less attachment, and look at and start to be curious about why I believed what I believed, how I had come to have those kind of attitudes, which were not really a part of my personality about other aspects, where I was living, and how to be curious about how practice and teachings were being manifest and how my own tradition came from there, and set me on a path of, after that moment of, not like that one moment was a watershed moment. I mean, it might have been months or even years after it that I reflected on it, but that moment played this key role in examining who in the world I was to think and talk like that, and having that as a jumping off point for curiosity and interest. And it was a hard journey. I mean, let me say, it was a really, really difficult journey with no real guide to trying to understand these things, which were not just academic or being curious, but was part and parcel of the spiritual life I was trying to live and the greater ethical life of who I was in this world. And 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 that journey that went forward. Where I'm going with all this is wanting to come back to your own story and where you were at that moment, because as I share from my background and this moment, I was buying this hook, line, and sinker. I was internalizing this methodology, this rationalization, this rationale of the superiority of what I was practicing, and the kind of proud close-mindedness of anything else. And breaking down those walls was a difficult and painful process that took many years of living there, conversations, reflections, readings, travels, etc. I want to throw that back to you and wonder, like, where you were at that moment. So you hear this, and one way you could respond is by saying, "Oh, I see. Okay, so we're practicing something pure, or something more direct, or something more accurate, or effective, or whatever adjective one wants to use. Okay, this I'm now going to somehow pledge a greater allegiance or trust to this organization or methodology or teacher." That certainly is one way that one could respond. That is the way I responded when I had moments like that in my young career as a young when I was a young meditator, I certainly responded that way at those times. So I'm wondering, when you heard this expression being said, how did it affect you? Did it
Yeah.
did it involve you in the message? Did you resist it? Was it just academic curiosity? Did you want to know more? How did something, this is a profound thing to hear from someone that's in a position of authority being told to you as a younger meditator. So how did that sink in with you?
Yeah, but the difference in the context you're talking about and mine is that actually there was a slightly different message here, right?
Hmm.
I was in India, and actually it was an Indian sort of modernist meditator, sort of poo-pooing the Burmese tradition. And it was so actually so different from what Goenka was teaching, which is
Hmm.
like he has this, there's this pristine pure teaching from Burma that he's
I
bringing,
see.
right? And
Mm.
so it was actually the triangulation,
Mm.
right? The cultural triangulation, and the sort of messiness of that forced a complexity. I had been in Burma, right? I understood the distinction between Mahasi Sayadaw and Goenkaji. I knew there were differences, but I also understood that, there was some basic commonalities, right? And I think it was an Indian meditator, quite, important guy, saying, "We have the true Dhamma here. They just have a lot of faith, those Buddhists in Burma." And so that was a really different kind of dynamic.
Mm.
I had experienced something like similar things to what you're talking about in Burma, right? Where, when I
Mm.
was hanging out on the yatra, and these Mahasi practitioners came to me and said, "You don't have the true teachings. Come to
Mm.
us, our center. Um, we're students of the Mahasi Sayadaw. We have the true, we have the true teachings there. Don't mess around with Goenkaji."
Mhm.
And so I knew that that was actually a dynamic in Burma itself, right?
Mm.
And then I saw this other thing happening in India. Um, Also, I had this lucky experience, in that first yatra in 2000, when actually I think Goenkaji was really excited to be back in Burma for the first time, and he in particular had, this connection with, the Shui Umin Sayadaw, who was
Right.
quite
Yeah.
old at that time, but still around. And he very much actually encouraged all of his students at that time to go and meet Shui Umin and get teachings from him. And this was, again, an interesting moment where I met the Shui Umin. We sort of had a conversation. He sort of very much underwrote, like, the way Goenkaji taught and the way we were talking about it, but sort of,
Mhm.
they clearly had their own tradition. And again, I remember a moment there also when one of, Shui Umin's students, she was sort of translating for us, and then afterwards sort of pushed her her lineage idea and said, "Oh, you don't, Goenkaji doesn't really teach the heart-based practice. If you want the real deal, you should come here to Shui Umin."
Mhm. Mhm.
So, just very early on for me, that I understood there were these interesting lineage identities and ties, that there were different approaches, but also there were commonalities, that there were also relationships that needed to maintain, and then there were real cultural differences that had to be negotiated. And so the moment in India, just, it was so institutional, right? It was so
Mhm.
clear that there was, we're doing something that would be for the institution, that would be representative of the institution, their very specific needs, and these cultural dynamics are coming into them, these cultural biases are coming into them. Oh, this is complicated, and it needs to be explored and interrogated. And so, yeah, like having those things all in my sort of pocket experientially from, 2000 onward. Also, even in the, being in Japan and seeing the dynamics there, right? Because, practicing Vipassana in Japan, where you have all these other forms of Buddhism, it's quite interesting, right? The Zen tradition. So that was seeing the dynamics around that, like going to group sittings at my good friend's house who hosted the group sittings, and then this really sweet young Vipassana meditator coming there, but also who visits Zen meditation centers, right?
Mhm.
And him talking about Zen and really being interested in the like relationships. And then when he leaves, this friend of mine sort of insulting Zen and saying Zen is nonsense. And I'm like, well, this
Mhm.
guy seems really sweet. I'm also studying Zen Buddhism, the
Mhm.
history of it.
Mhm.
Um, it was it was like this young Japanese guy talking about I don't know if you know the like Hakuin, the Zen student, the Zen teacher, very famous Rinzai teacher, right? He had, I guess he at one point he got highly imbalanced doing meditation, and he sought out a technique to balance his energy and balance his practice. They call this Zen sickness, actually.
Mhm.
And he got this what's called the butter technique, right, which is very similar to the body scan.
Mhm.
It's sort of like a balancing technique that you move from head to feet, and it's in the Zen tradition. It's actually in the early Chinese Buddhist traditions coming out of India. And I remember this young Japanese guy talking about this and saying, "Oh, that's a connection between Zen and Vipassana, like the body
Mm.
scan." And then this like very rigid friend of mine who I was very close with, sort of when this guy left, just sort of insulting this idea, and there's no connection, there's no relationship. So yeah,
Mhm.
it's in these different, so many different cultural contexts. I had, from fairly early on in my relationship to the tradition, seeing these different lines getting drawn both in Burma and in India and in Japan,
Mhm.
across various lines of Buddhist identity and practice identity, cultural identity. I thought this needs to be interrogated.
So do you see something universal in that? Something human across form and culture and everything?
Yeah, I think it's everywhere. It's in all traditions.
Mm.
And so actually, I never thought it was necessarily all bad, right? And this is
Mhm.
why I, to this day, feel fine telling people I'm a student of Goenkaji. I'm a
Mhm.
diehard student of Goenkaji. He's my guru.
Mhm.
And I very much actually value that idea, in fact. And in fact, I got even more into it when I learned the background of Goenkaji's relationship to his teacher, Uba Ken, who was
Mhm.
very much invested in a classical guru model, a
Mhm.
traditional model where a teacher, is someone you really do kind of look up to and seek protection from. And in fact, it's a special kind of relationship and a special kind of bond. Um, and if you take that seriously, it doesn't have to be rigid, right? And of course, it can become that way, like some kind of rigid identity. And I think in some sense it's easy to read, for instance, Goenkaji's relationship to his teacher in that way sometimes, because it sometimes seems quite rigid. But I think if we understand these kinds of relationships as actually sort of constituting a supportive, kind of meditative relationship, right?
Mhm.
That's really about a kind of ethical responsibility of care that a teacher has to a student, and actually that a student has to a teacher, right? Then the lineage identity side of it doesn't have to be all bad. It's
Mhm.
when we sort of blindly identify without realizing there's actually some practical use to these relationships that I think very quickly it becomes maladaptive and unhelpful. And unfortunately, that happens a lot. And these examples we're talking about, right? I think,
Mhm.
I'm also think I have myself historically participated in those, in many ways, in the way that you yourself talked about, um,
Mhm.
doing it in your story in Burma. I think I've done that myself at certain moments.
Mhm.
But in retrospect, now with sort of a broader understanding of some of these things, and seeing the diversity of how those things happen. Um, I think it can have really kind of problematic sides. And then I think there's a real integrity to the notion of lineage, to the notion of a guru disciple um, relationship, that,
Mhm.
this model of parampara in traditional Indian, the passing down the teachings from teacher to pupil and staying connected to one guru that's sort of your main teacher, and things like that. And I actually think that is the model even in Burma, even though a lot of people go to a lot of places. When in the end, the model is you settle on your teacher and you stick to that practice.
Hmm.
Even though it does seem much more diverse, I think this is what I've seen sort of predominating. It doesn't mean you don't go and visit every possible monk you can and give them
Hmm.
dana or something like
Mhm.
that,
Mhm.
because of course you would. But yeah, anyway, I think it's an interesting question and a dynamic. But again, most of those ideas are kind of not what a lot of Western practitioners get themselves involved in. So this is the sort of other aspect we haven't talked so much about, right? But this is
Mhm.
sort of my North American experience, right? Would be sort of different in this relationship, right? So the dynamics become slightly different than in all these Asian contexts we've been talking about up till now.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I would like to. And I want to get into the meat and the content of some of the things that you've uncovered, some of your theories, the background of some of what you've written that hasn't been released and isn't available yet. But before we do, there's just one thing I wanted to touch upon. You said in you describe yourself as a diehard Goenka meditator, as someone that that truly believes in well, you didn't say this. I don't want to suggest I'm quoting this, but hearing diehard meditator, it definitely sounds like to me someone who certainly believes in the teacher, the technique, the practice, gets the benefit from it. And even after, maybe especially after you've done the research and explored this in that kind of depth, making a statement like that sounds like it's not lessening your faith, it's increasing your faith. And in sharing that research and wanting to broadcast and to make public the things that you find as a self-described diehard Goenka meditator, when some of this material has been released, it is not the reaction from other people in the meditative community has not been so encouraging, to say the least. And this is a moment to give some background for this talk. I would say this talk has been years in the making of discussing in different ways and in very kind of patient and steady way of the possibilities of this. And I should also say for the listener base that we have an agreement with this talk because it is so sensitive and the stakes are so high in some ways that none of this talk will be released without your consent and hearing it and being comfortable. And so this very much is a tentative step in seeing how it sounds to start to go down this road. And so I think there could be something unexplained or contradictory that needs to be unpacked. If doing this research has made you more, or if you came into this research being a diehard Goenka meditator and doing the research has not lessened but increased your faith, then where would the pushback come from? Why would there be an issue in those in the community not being happy with what you're doing, and where is that personal risk or hesitation or discomfort in wanting to make something public that has only increased your faith in the practice that you're doing and researching?
It's a really good question. It's sort of complicated because I think, my version, for instance, of faith um, might not be the same version as everyone else. Let's put it that way, right? I think often, my sort of interrogation of the tradition and my interest in a lot of these sort of gray areas, right? These spaces in between cultures, in between lineages, in between identities, in between models of practice, right? Um, in between the ancient and the modern. There are a lot of in betweens, right? Like I think for most people, that kind of middle ground is not a place to find faith or confidence or comfort. So I think in some ways I'm a little bit of a, uh, kind of idiosyncratic person. And so I think a lot of, at least the experience I've had, is when I've been in the communities in various contexts and I've raised questions and interrogated issues, it's not been received as helpful or supportive of a more kind of simple, coherent institutional story. And also this also so is the case in people I've met over many years in the community who have themselves been pushed out, or ostracized in this way or that, because they've interrogated questions of the sort that I'm interested in. So there's just a long history of people like me who are interested in kind of being uncomfortable in
Hmm.
between things, kind of not finding a place, and in fact often being kind of explicitly pushed out or excluded, and for various reasons. I mean, whether it's because you're asking the wrong question, or because you don't fit the mold, right? um, so for instance, people getting pushed out because they decided they wanted, or somehow it became out that they weren't fitting some normative model of the perfect practitioner, like they were gay or something like that. And again, that's a kind of interesting question to raise, for instance, to interrogate kind of normative South Asian ethics, and where those normative ethical models don't jive with a more diverse perspective on sort of living ethically in modernity. So yeah, it's a complicated thing, and the kinds of questions I ask that for me fit fine and lead me to be able to maintain my deep connection to Goenkaji and to Sahajuba Kin and to the Burmese tradition and to the Indian Theravada tradition. I've also explored like the Sanskrit Buddhist traditions and a whole variety. I read Chinese and I study the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And for me, this diversity like just kind of helps me feel connected to the whole thing. For many others, this is confusing. This is, makes things unclear. And I think this is actually a legitimate concern of of a community trying to just do one thing, right? Which is to give a basic practice across many countries, many communities, and give something that everyone everywhere can connect with, right? To complicate things, to make it layered, to make it gray, is does not serve that project, right? um, and I myself have seen real negative effects of my own work, right? So when I write a book about Goenkaji, who I love and respect, but also point out, oh, he did certain things, he did these things, and then someone reads it and says, oh, I don't like what he did, right? And Daniel Stuart is the one saying he did it, right? And for so many years we didn't talk about this, right? Um, it just so it's a complicated scenario, and yes, I don't think there's an easy
Hmm.
answer, but for sure it's people like me are a threat to institutions that want simple stories, simple ideas
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
everyone can sort of accept without too much um, thinking and too much interrogation and stuff like that. And it makes me nervous to do the work I do. And in fact, in some cases, I feel like maybe I could be harming people by,
Mhm.
by sort of, bringing out things that could really give people the wrong idea in some instances. Yeah. I mean, even though my intention is to give them the right idea or give them information that would, you know, possibly help them understand the tradition better, it might put people off, right? It might, so those are complicated questions that I don't have even simple or good answers to myself.
So we should say that this conversation is a work in progress, where we're still figuring things out on a personal as well as academic journey. And I suppose for the next stage of the conversation that follows, we should have a bit of a trigger warning for Goenka Vipassana meditators that are listening in, that would those that would be upset or disturbed to have the narrative challenge that the structural integrity that the organization has put forward. Those that would find that being poked and prodded and additional information and context added, that would find that disturbing, that this would probably be a good time to take a break and think about whether or not you want to come back as we get to the nitty gritty. With that trigger warning in play, I think this is a really good segue. I think for this first hour, we've talked around a lot of this, and the first part of that was very necessary because I think it's important to know a bit about you and where you're coming from. You're not one of these academic scholars that just picks up the Goenka tradition to something interesting to explore, but you're an insider an insider in the sense of a practitioner and meditator, a die-hard meditator of the tradition that has come to want to know more about it and have used your academic skills to educate yourself and to learn these things and to learn not just about the lineage but the wider context that it fits into. And so for those that want to engage in that further conversation and an education about some of these matters, even where it might seem at least superficially to, or maybe even at a deeper level, to conflict or to offer a different view of what the organization has put forward, I think this is a good opportunity to segue into some of what those findings are. And we're not going to cover everything and the whatever is ahead of us in this conversation. And we hope to have future conversations going into this. So it'll just be an initial introduction into the topic. And we talked before this interview about the best way to approach this. Do we start with the beginning, and what is the beginning? Is the beginning Lady Sayadaw? Does it come before that? Do we start in modern day? Do we look at Goenka as a man and his mission that he set up, or Ubakin and their relationship, or the Burmese Buddhist context? There's just so many starting points that we can have, and wherever that starting point is, it will then link with all these other types of things and matters to look into. And we still haven't quite figured that out. So maybe the best way to approach this is to ask the question of looking at the research that you've done and the understanding that you've gained, and thinking about the somewhat of the average Goenka meditator or teacher or long-term student and their practice and understanding. What would come out as an important divergence between those? If and I know there's many, and that again, that also depends on which area of focus or time period a person we want to have. But just to kick the conversation off, if let's just imagine a scenario that a Goenka meditator was coming to you and learning about your background and what you did, and this was someone well steeped in the discourses and the tradition, the lineage, had read some of the books, and would just ask a question. Well, what am I missing? What is it that I've been practicing or have been told that greater context or research could add or shift my understanding? What's a good first takeaway for me to have that will start giving me food for thought and reflection beyond what I've been given in the organization? So to kick it off that way, what topic would you start with there?
Yeah, well, that's a tough one because, so, I mean, the thing is, you meet so many people, and in the organization, it's so huge now. And people often have, you know, depending on where they're coming from, depending on their interests, depending on how much exposure they've had, right? They're gonna come with different assumptions.
Mhm.
So I don't know, are we talking about someone who's done just a few courses, or, you know, it's a tough one because I meet a lot of different people,
Mhm.
and I think the biggest question most people have,
Mhm.
and this tends to be a concern of kind of the modern Vipassana practitioner, is like, Goenkaji says that this is the, pure, pristine teaching as the Buddha taught it. Like, now, does, you're a scholar of Buddhism, right? Does this fit with the early texts? Because this is some idea, right? That the earliest textual sources, right, are how we understand what the Buddha taught, right? Um, and that seems to be like a big, one of the big questions that comes up. And immediately there we have to say, oh well, like what we're learning now from Goenkaji, right? And if you go back to the early texts and compare it to that, like, surprise surprise, like, there's not a perfect correlation between what we read in the sort of earliest teachings of the Buddha available to historians and what Goenkaji teaches. And this immediately, if you take it seriously, opens up just a whole range of big questions, right? Historical questions. So if it's not exactly the same because, there's some historical differences, what are the differences and why? Right? And that's where we start saying, like, where's the point in history, for instance, that we would need to look to answer those kinds of questions, right? Now, as a scholar of Buddhism, there are a lot of different inflection points you could use to do this. So, like, if I would focus on sort of the history of Buddhism in India, right, first, we could do a lot already there before even, you know before the tradition gets exported to places like Burma and China and Sri Lanka. We can already see huge developments over hundreds of years of social change and innovation after the Buddha died, right? um, Meditation theory, within 500 years after the Buddha died, we have huge development of various lineages of meditation in India itself, of all sorts, different traditions, different scholarly traditions, different traditions of actual meditative lineages. And so you could do a huge amount. You could learn a huge amount just by focusing on, like, the first 500 years after the Buddha, which is actually one of my main kind of areas of expertise, is this
Mhm.
early period, um, in the Pāli and the Sanskrit literature, and in reflected in translated literature that's been preserved in China and Tibet and Central Asia and other places. Most people don't want to really hear about that, because it somehow seems irrelevant, right? It's actually usually like, well, what do these earliest texts say, and how do I fit it with what I'm doing now, right? And so usually my answer is no, no. We have to do a much more we have to tell a much more complicated story, and it's actually hard to do justice to that. And I'm not sure it's something we would want to spend a lot of time on in this conversation, but it's certainly something that just anyone who's asking that basic question should be interested in, actually. Not what the earliest texts say necessarily, but actually, like, what was happening very early in how those earliest traditions already were changing very dynamically, and probably even in the Buddha's life, right, were highly dynamic. It was a huge sangha. You had 80 years of teaching, at least according to the traditional model. You had Brahmins, you had the Jain tradition, people coming from all kinds of different ascetic communities with different ideas, different philosophical approaches. different ideas to how one would take up the Buddha's teachings and practice them, right? Already going on. Hugely dynamic, diverse context. And the Buddha was engaging all of this. And then after he died, it was going on for hundreds of years before the teachings then got exported to other places. So, yeah, I don't think we could go into those kinds of details. But if already things are so dynamic and
Hmm.
historically malleable and changing in historical context in India, in the early centuries of the Common Era, then surely what happens as they spread out to places like Burma and over the next 1500 years or so, and get influenced by local cultural contexts, and the new texts get written, new scholarly ideas come up, right? Then we're bound to have a tradition in modernity that is affected by those changes, right? So it's just basic historical perspective. But somehow we still have this idea that we're gonna get a teaching that's exactly what the Buddha taught then, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I think this is the question: is it possible, right, that, for instance, the teaching we have and are getting today, however we get it, right, from whatever modern tradition that we're seeking it from, right, can it be what the Buddha himself taught, right? And this is what so many people seem really into. Um, and that was certainly my interest, when one of my main interests, which is why I wanted to read all the Pali scriptures, like study the ancient history and know all these different things. Um, so that's one key. Like, I think the minute you look at the earliest text and compare it to what is being taught in, say, the Goenka institution, probably many people won't like me to call it that, right? You're going to find just differences. You're going to find things that are not in the early teachings, right? Um, that are unique to the modern traditions, right? And so this is something I've done. For instance, I used to teach pretty regularly at the Pāli program, at the Magiri, and then at the Global Pagoda, and I tended to sort of give talks on these kinds of issues, right? Like, oh, like, let's look at this idea that the body is made up of kalapas, right? This is such an important part of what Goenkaji teaches, right? We're made up of subatomic particles, and the Buddha understood this. And then you go to the earliest texts, and lo and behold, that idea is not there, that term's not there, because this is a tradition, a scholarly tradition that developed later and was sort of, used to reinterpret some of the earlier texts. And then it became central to the meditative traditions, um, pretty early on, actually, in the first centuries of the Common Era, and then stayed relevant up until the modern uh, Burmese meditation context. But for many people, that immediately you teach that, and they're already like, "What?" Right? Because they've been told by
Sure.
Goenkaji, this is the teaching of the
Yeah.
Buddha. So there's just one
Yeah.
example. Okay, like
Yeah.
we can do multiple things. Like the paramis is another good example, right? Like this teaching where we cultivate virtues over many lifetimes to become enlightened, right? This is the basic idea that one would cultivate karma over many lifetimes to become enlightened, and is there in the early tradition, but there's no list of paramis, there's no kind of accounting for all the different virtues you must have to become an arhat, as we have in the later commentarial tradition that Goenkaji draws on to teach about these things. Um, it's important to note that this idea runs through like all the Buddhist traditions from very early on, right? But we don't find reference to it in the oldest texts, right? Now, one of the questions is like, should that matter? Does it matter? Is my benchmark what's in the earliest texts, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And now everyone is going to have a different relationship to that, right? But it should be noted that that idea is not in keeping with how Buddhists in most of history thought, right? In fact, that idea fits very well with one particular strand of religious thought. Um, it's the Protestant tradition, right? That says, like, the true teachings can be found in this one holy book, right? That was written down and printed for us to engage personally with, right? Um, and so, again, what's our relationship to tradition? It's an interesting one. So,
Hmm.
for me, this was always there, sort of looming this tension. But I also always sort of connected with the idea that actually these practices are about connecting with a teacher, Goenkaji, right? And he got his teachings from a teacher, right? And there's a tradition of practice that's central, right? And there's a dynamic around authenticity, there's a dynamic around proving, right, that this goes back to the Buddha. um, but is that really what this is all about at the end of the day, right? And one of the things that I started looking at is how important that really was to people like Ubakin and his teacher Sayataji and others. Like, what made them compelled to practice? Were they concerned about that issue, right? Um, it seems they weren't all that concerned about it. They were directly engaging these experiences,
Hmm.
and they did have to sort of prove that what they were doing was authentic, right?
Hmm.
But their way of doing that was different
Hmm.
than, like, say, a Protestant who says, let's find the earliest texts and prove this, right, based on a historical analysis, right? um, and one particularly interesting question in this regard is, what were the different ways that people felt confident about the authenticity of their traditions? Now, there are a lot of sort of paths to explore for how one might think about that. But it seems really kind of important to me when you at least go to someone like Sayagyi Bakin. I've sort of found myself drawn to his context because he seems to be this key intermediary, right, between the Burmese local tradition and a sort of global um, modern Vipassana. It doesn't seem he was all that concerned with that sort of Protestant idea, right? And one great story that I love that sort of helps me think about this is the story of one of his disciples. He had an Indian disciple by the name of Venkataraman. And very quickly, this student attained high attainments. He was a master of jhana, um, and he had psychic powers. And one of the main ways that this was clear that Ubakin had the authentic teaching, right, was that he could bring this student to these high stages, and this psychic experience that his student had was to directly interact with the guardian deities of the sasana, right? That is the actual teachings of the Buddha, right, as they were passed down historically in Deva realms, in the realm of deities. So now let's ask ourselves this question. If you are in a world in which that all is very concretely real,
Hmm.
right, and your psychic student has direct contact with deities who have known the historical Buddha in history,
Hmm.
in actual history, because they're living long lives, right? What kind of sort of authenticity of the early textual tradition matters? Um, So this is something that most students of Goenka probably aren't going to sort of listen to and say, "Oh yeah, now I'm comfortable that this is the authentic teaching." But this is the kind of thing that I think we
Hmm.
would have to take seriously and explore if we want to actually understand sort of the differences between what we hear and get in, say, the way it's the teachings have been taught in the Goenka institution now, right? And only less than 100 years ago were being taught in Burma, right? And so this question of authenticity and how one would decide what's authentic, right, is you have to basically assess what are the criteria that any
Hmm.
individual would use, and these are radically different cultural approaches to the question of authenticity.
Yeah,
Um,
and I appreciate that, and I think that you're right. For a Goenka practitioner listening, I think it can be upsetting. It can be disturbing to contemplate and go down that road. That even with this kind of context that you're presenting on authenticity, there still just comes a question like, this teacher said this thing, is this correct or not? And what moving off of that basic question can be hard to do. It can be hard to want to look at some of these other mitigating and contextual matters, because the essential thing is just, this is what he said. And for those that are adherents to the practice and wanting to not get, we could say, messy, or too into ideas away from the practice, too into the theoretical, that there's also this real pull and presence of practice being the thing that gives you answers, and theory and intellectual matters the thing that confuses you. And so that should actually be avoided. It should just be following the practice given by the teacher. That's what's going to provide the own answers. But I think that when this question is there, there could be a sense of different roads that a practitioner would go down. One road being, well, I'm not going to get into that because that's just theory and intellect, and I'm just going to engage in the practice part of it because that's the most important. That's, as mentioned, that's one. And another would be to cherry pick and to look for those kind of historical references that may not hold up in something very serious, professionally peer reviewed, but would at least be some kind of stopgap for being able to say, oh, look, there's this and this, that's enough, we can end here, that references it. But I think to have the to have somewhat of the patience and the curiosity and the comfort with being at unease, to be able to look into these wider questions, is valuable. And yet I think to many it just still comes down to, like, well, is it correct what he said or not? And if it is correct, doesn't this validate it as the practice doing what it says it does? And if it's not correct, in other words, if we can't find the academic background to support what he's saying, then why would he say this? And what does this mean about my practice? And so it
yeah,
sounds like there could be a couple of parallel discourses going on here.
yeah, yeah. But that's sort of why I bring up that, you know, some would probably conceptualize it as a pretty extreme example, right, of sort of, radical difference. And of course, one could do something different with it, interpretively. Um, but it's more that if we want to understand our tradition, right, we have to understand who Goenkaji really was, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I think this isn't something I try to explore in the short book I wrote about him, right? That actually, like, we have multiple understandings even of who he was within different communities, and um, so even this person who's quite close to us historically, right, actually appears in different guises depending on your access to sources, right? Your access to knowledge about him, right? Um, that should raise huge questions for us all more generally about how we think about history. right? If someone's so close to us, and we can do this with anyone.
Hmm.
Let's take like the multiple biographies of Winston Churchill, right? And like
Hmm.
how different he comes off, right? In a biography written by a critical person, a biography written by someone who sort of wants to laud the man, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so when we ask that question, like, are these teachings like what the actual historical Buddha taught? We probably want to sort of raise the same issue, and sort of that's, as a scholar, right, as an academic, that's sort of where we end up. And so what are the ground that we have, what's the ground that we have to make, you know, to sort of decide, right? And this is, I think, why the idea comes down to often, does this feel good to you, right? Do you get the benefit, right? Because that
Hmm.
seems like something that, everyone can sort of assess for themselves. Like, do this practice, do you get a benefit? Let's not go further than that, right?
Right.
And this is, I think, interrogating that has been problematic enough in itself.
Mm. Well, there's the famous discourse that, or the famous analogy that Goenka himself gives in a discourse about the housewife with the laundry detergent, if I remember correctly, and it's in that in the telling that it's not the job of the housewife to know why the laundry detergent is doing what it's supposed to be doing and removing stains. It's simply following the protocol and instructions of what has to be done in order to apply the detergent in the correct way so the stains come out. And the story is being shared in the context of, you don't need to understand who the meditator, you don't need to understand all the academic texts or what the historical Buddha or why the technique is working this way. You just need to apply it, and it will work. And this, on one hand, this could be seen as a call to practice and an urgency of practice. On the other hand, it could be seen and is often used along with other kinds of stories and methodologies as a anti-intellectualism of students to distrust academics and written knowledge and texts, that these are things that are inherently untrustworthy. And I think this brings into question the overall place in the field where that I think you step into, you uniquely step into, and in that, on one side we have we there's from the organization itself, and from whether it's people, actually authors actually directly associated with the organization, or practitioners, where the organization, I should say, either books that are coming out through VRI, the Vipassana Research Institute, or Pariyati, that that are publishing books by those that may not be directly affiliated, but are definitely in line with the mission and with the sentiments expressed within the organizational philosophy and structure. So on one hand, you have these kind of insiders of one way or the other writing about their experience, or something, maybe trying to get a little more technical, or whatever, but definitely people that are very much inside practitioners speaking to one another, and maybe also speaking to the potential of bringing in new students to the tradition. And then on the other side, you have very much non-Goenka practitioners, maybe even scholars who are non-practitioners overall, writing about the rise of the mindfulness movement, of the spread of Buddhism, spread of meditation, whichever word one wants to use, because obviously there are those who are looking at the mindfulness movement. Whether you say mindfulness or meditation or Buddhism, people have very strong reactions to each of these words. So whichever word one is using, there are those that have written about it. And for the most part, in what I've seen, the tremendous rise and spread of the Goenka Vipassana teachings around the world are largely left off of all of these studies. And when they are written about, even me, as somewhat of a lay reader, will just identify all kinds of mistakes and misunderstandings and simplifications and reductions from these scholars who are just simply not understanding the deeper issues involved. And then you step in right in the middle of this, where you're bringing this kind of professional, steeped academic, scholarly focus into it, and yet you're also an insider into the culture, the practice, the teachings, the fact that sometimes what is said is not what is actually done, that there are certain rules of culture that are more unwritten, and then there are those that are spoken, that are kind of what you say, but they're not as followed as much, and you're trying to step into the middle of all of this and write about it and touch about it. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the challenge of that role of trying to of knowing the practice and the tradition and the respect and the benefit that you have, while also trying to follow certain kind of academic principles, and perhaps also commenting on why, for a movement that has been this big and this important, why has this gap been unfilled for so long, and why is there no one else like you who's carrying this burden?
Yeah, it's a really actually a puzzling thing, and which is why I find doing the work I'm doing so difficult, because not only do most insider practitioners not want to hear what I have to say, but also most scholars do not want to hear what I have to say. It's a very
Wow,
strange situation.
amazing.
Um, and I think that actually the scholar side is much stranger in a sense, because you can easily explain why, practitioners in a close knit kind of culty community don't want their kind of stories and ideas challenged. Um, but why Goenka has been so ignored, by, or just very like oversimplified by a huge range of highly intelligent historians and scholars, is a very puzzling, um, question. I mean, one simple reason is that because the community is so close knit and closed off, and there's been actually they've been quite successful at not sort of letting the real story sort of get out there in a sense. Um, but also, I think it really is just got to do with sort of scholarly laziness. It's sad to say this, but the scholars who sort of should have done the work, and sort of should have accessed the sources, just somehow didn't feel like they needed to. They somehow, I think there was a story written about Goenka very early on, like in the 90s, that, he's just this guy. He took these teachings out of Burma and sort of, repackaged them in this simple way, and we don't really need to talk much more about it, right? um, which I think has been a major error, particularly because he's been so successful and influential and becoming global, right? The way his ideas have populated different communities in different ways is in fact quite complicated. If you, for instance, go and see what's happening now in the Goenka institution communities in Thailand or in China, right? Or in Nepal. It's like very interesting the way that the same basic teaching and practices, um, these same teachings and practices are getting kind of, culturally reformulated or engaged in these particular contexts, or, in a place like Lebanon, or the conflicts in a place like Iran, where they had a center for a long time and then they sort of had to stop teaching, and things like that, around questions of whether this is secular or religious. And so strange that such an interesting and important global, you know, um, tradition has been almost entirely overlooked. Um, yeah, I know a lot of the people who should have done this work, or should have at least, talked about this. And I think sadly one of the basic reasons is that it just takes a lot of work, and also people get sort of pushed out when they try to actually learn about these things. And even I'm a good example actually of someone who's got a lot of information, but also, because I'm not, really an insider, or not by accepted by some, right? Um, you know, certain information will certainly not be shared, with me, or whatever that is. So yeah, it's a really complicated situation, but also we had a single narrative that got written early on, and strangely, even though good scholars usually like to write new narratives or counter narratives, there has not really been a successful sort of counter narrative of this tradition up until the present for the last really 40 years or so. Um, so
Mm.
ideally, my work will help develop a counter narrative, but I don't know. I'm not hopeful, to be honest, because we have these stories, and the stories take on a life of their own. Um, and yeah, I don't know what kinds of details we would want to get into to really sort of like flesh out what are the pieces of the story that haven't been accounted for or need to be understood. We're sort of touching on some of these ideas about like the difference
Mhm.
of Ubakin's context and sort of, for instance, his attitude about authenticity. That was one sort of starting point, maybe, right? Or connections to Ubakin's teacher, right? Who's been almost entirely overlooked, right? This
Mhm.
really important first lay, key first lay teacher in Burma, right? Who people just know almost nothing about. Right, and
Mm.
what was going on with this in the early 20th century with all these people getting
Mhm.
into meditation, right?
Mhm.
We have this story that suddenly everyone started meditating, but no one seems to
Mhm.
care what these people were
Mhm.
actually doing, right? Like
Right.
what they were actually up to. um all we have like a story like, oh, they liked Abhidhamma. What does that actually mean,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
First of all, I don't think they really did like Abhidhamma that much. But yeah, we had, yeah, so yeah, it's a weird thing. It's in one way of thinking about it is this is actually just sort of colonial. No one actually cares what these people were doing.
Mhm.
Why? Because we're just looking for the moment when it comes to us here in the
Mhm.
West, and this is what I've seen a lot. Um, how do we get to us?
Yeah. Mm. Um, that's interesting. So you're discussing kind of where to wrap around and start to get into this, and that was one of the questions, one of the prompts I was going to give you is that going back, you said that there's this simple narrative that's being constructed of Goenka and how scholars usually like to break those narratives down, but in this case, and provide counter narratives, but in this case, for some reason, it just continues to be accepted at face value in articles and in books and everything else, that this one dimensional cartoonish narrative continues to be promoted while trying to look at the deeper context and flesh out a three-dimensional figure with historical matters going on around isn't being done. So how would you describe what this simple narrative is? What is the simple narrative of Goenka that gets repeated over and over and over again? And where do you start to nudge or add something or take something away or provide a bit of context that explains something else that starts to reshape what this simple narrative is?
How do we think about this? I think the simplest way to talk about this, it's a little complicated, but the simplest way to talk about this is that Goenka is not a human being. We don't treat him like a human being. We treat him as a purveyor of a technique. And in
Mm,
fact, that's all he is. He's not a
mhm,
human. He's not a person with feelings. He's
mm,
not, maybe we might talk about him as some kind of identity, like some kind of religious identity or something. But actually, the only real purpose he serves in history is as a purveyor of a technique that is
mm,
somehow just like floating and that we can all just do what we want with.
mhm,
And that technique also is just one thing. We don't like to actually look at like the fact that it's like a lot of things,
mhm,
even though there is actually quite a real integrity in terms of how, you know even going back to Ledi Sayadaw, how he taught sort of these body oriented practices, how his student Sayataji taught these body-oriented practices, how Ubakin taught these body-oriented practices. And there's a very clear continuity and, in fact, quite serious integrity of how the teaching was taught. But of course, what we talk about as the technique that Goenka taught and brought, and really is just Goenka is just a technique, basically. That technique doesn't look anything like what what these earlier versions of it were. It's just this thing that we now can see basically on YouTube or in a book called The Art of Living that's become really famous. Um, and we don't contextualize the technique as sort of in a set of relationships that are very personal, very intimate in many cases, right? And also tied into a whole range of different cultural, social dynamics that actually have to be quite specifically contextualized if we were to understand it, right? So I feel like the human aspect of Goenka basically just disappears because he's just a purveyor of this technique, and in a sense, that's the story he himself told, right? And that made it easier for him to just do what he wanted to do, which was to get people to practice what he was teaching. And he sort of used that language and but I think the question is whether we should take that story as historians, as academics, as people looking at what's really going on and accept it, right? Strangely, so many people have in weird ways, even very thoughtful and intelligent people. And this, I think, this in part is a colonial thing, which is that we don't and I'm here now not really talking about myself, but might as well be like white people in the West, right? Just actually don't really properly conceptualize these communities, right, as, as anything but sort of something we can get something out of, in history. It's a very sad legacy of the colonial tradition that we're still living with today.
That's really interesting. So that's bringing like this Orientalist attitude to non-white worlds and non-white actors, where these people are doing what the role that they're playing is all setting up a plate where I, as a white person, can come and feast off of it and enjoy it. And they've kind of done their role. They've served their purpose, and they're looking through these potentially looking through these kind of Orientalist lens. And that actually kind of, if that's a direction you're going, that's something that has definitely been on my mind with the coup in Myanmar recently. That the real pain that I've had as someone who cares deeply about the country and people, and also about the tradition and teachings, is that there's this divergence between what you always hear said from Goenka and on courses and from teachers, this debt of gratitude we have for Burma and the way these teachings were preserved and carried there until we had them, till they had access to us, and then trying to raise the flag and light the lanterns and say, okay, well these people we've been talking about that we care so much, they're now three-dimensional people that are in like lots of danger, and many of these people are intrinsically connected to the preservation of these techniques with some of the historical sites and the centers that are still active, and they very much need our help. And some divergence with wanting to hold somewhat of a colonial image of what these historical people have done to bring a technique and a teaching to us that's more of an imaginary figment of a fantasy that is telling a story that makes us feel good, but perhaps is not really grounded in real three-dimensional relationships and seeing those fully fleshed out figures. I wonder what you would think of that, but I want to add another thing on before asking you another thought that came, is that when you're talking about this colonial perspective of Goenka, what it makes me think of as well is this difference between passive and active, and that through a colonial lens, Goenka is a passive actor where he is he is coming into form, playing a fated role of being a purveyor or a carrier of a technique that does his job, and then is able to step back, and then that reaches us, and that's where the story really begins. If you're looking at Goenka as an active participant, then you're looking at a complex figure with different motivations and feelings, and who's making decisions, and some of those decisions are better than others. But even the ones that are very good, as nature of what any decision is, there's always a sacrifice or a loss that comes with choosing this path instead of this one, something you give up in order to get that. And as this active figure is plotting this carefully strategic vision of what he wants to build and how he's doing it and how he's proceeding, that is that kind of looking in that kind of way and that kind of examination really breaks this passive colonial outlook as just someone who is just stepping into a role, doing the role that he was preordained to do, and then the story picks off once he's done his mission, rather than this active figure who is in the moment trying to lay out a roadmap for something that never existed before, and just the innovation and the intelligence, the dynamicism that he had, as well as, perhaps some of the things that he didn't do as well as he could have, or that, having the advantage of historical perspective, we can look back and see the effect of some decisions that maybe have consequences that weren't understood then. But
Yeah, I mean, I do think we can't really, you know, totally disambiguate these two things you're talking about, right? Which is sort of our attitudes. I mean, again, I don't want to oversimplify it, because obviously it's complicated with Goenkaji in particular, because he's coming out of Burma in a colonial context. He's coming to India in a post-colonial context, and he's teaching globally, transnationally, right? And so there are actually a lot of different cultural dynamics, and this is the sort of point I made with my initial kind of encounter there in India, with this sort of triangulation, right, between the global, the scientific modern, the Indian cultural identity, and the Burmese tradition. And so it's obviously much more complicated than just a simple like us and them, and the colonial frame. But I do think this basic idea that, a lot of scholars working today, are noticing, particularly scholars coming out of sort of the South American historical tradition, right, who have pointed out that, you know, the the legacies of colonialism tend to continue in ways that are very subtle, but that very powerfully implicate all of us all the time, right? So this idea of coloniality in modernity now, something we thought we would all, be beyond at this point, right? And yet when we start looking at it, really interrogating our practices, really interrogating the dynamics, for instance, between the global north and the global south, we see these really kind of these ruts of thought, these ruts of civilizational divides, that seem to stick with us, right? And so what I find so remarkable is that despite the fact that we have very thoughtful and intelligent historians working on, the history of mindfulness, they tend not to have understood this particular issue, and tend to sort of be replicating these colonial dynamics. And I think that very same thing is at work in the way that um, people are callously ignoring contexts such as we're seeing in Myanmar today, right? Where people have connections to these communities and traditions in some sort of, yeah, as you put it, in a kind of fantasy of that beautiful Burma, right? The sort of Burma I visited when I went on pilgrimage, right? And yet we don't really take that down to the ground. and and see these communities in their lived context, and then really identify with the suffering, which is already extreme even before we had the coup and war, right? We already had really a tough situation in much of Burma, right? It's just, even just basic people getting livelihoods. Things were, of course, developing in ways that we thought were sort of more normatively progressive. But I think even before the coup, there was a disconnect between the real human worlds, right? For many of these meditators, it's sort of in and out, right? You go in, you have your meditation experience, you can, you have your sort of fantasy world of that different place, and then you go back and you show your friends pictures, right? And it's what's strange. So again, this is sort of, meditation tourism. What's strange is that modern scholars are basically doing this in their narrativizing of the tradition too, and that should not be happening as much. Now, it might not be totally fair, because there obviously are some scholars that are more thoughtful and a bit more sophisticated than this, particularly serious Burmese historians who are really looking on the ground at other dynamics. But people who are studying meditation tend not to have that kind of sophistication and that kind of engagement, unfortunately. Just so happens to be the case. They're either ideological agendas, or just they're looking for a simple story, or the story that's already there works well enough, right?
Yeah, I think these are all issues that just take so much time to explore and to go into the depth. We're already at the 2 hour mark, and we're still just kind of talking about what we want to talk about instead of that subject itself, which is kind of par for the course. That just these things take a lot of time to understand and approach in the right way. And I think this has served as a really good introductory talk for just how one approaches this matter. And sometimes it's not so much about what the correct answer is, it's more about the correct questions, or the different kinds of questions that could be asked to explore it. And I think this talk has gotten a lot more into the framing of those questions than the actual answers. And we can look at having some future conversations that start to go into some of those answers and some of those data, now that we've established or at least discussed and looked at different ways of approaching this context. So, thanks so much for coming on and doing this for the first time. It's really been a thrill, and I've just enjoyed this conversation so much.
Well, thanks for having me, Joe. It's been a great conversation for me too. Just really fun to explore so many different, maybe too abstract ideas here, but hopefully we can get a little more grounded in future conversations.
We've come to the end of this discussion, and we thank you for spending your last couple of hours with us. I also want to let you know that we've recorded a lot more discussions that touch on similar themes to what was explored today. This is because over the years, we've curated a rich archive now numbering in the hundreds of episodes, freely available to all. Among these are in-depth conversations with guests who explore Buddhist teachings and meditation practices, shedding light on the profound spiritual traditions that are deeply woven into Myanmar's culture. These discussions offer insights into mindfulness, compassion, and spiritual development, timeless principles that resonate far beyond the borders of the Golden Land. However, producing and preserving this archive requires significant time and resources, and we rely on listeners like you to help sustain it. If you found inspiration or guidance in today's episode, or from any of the wealth of teachings and meditative reflections maintained in our archive, we invite you to support our work. Your generosity helps us to continue production and to share these valuable conversations, while ensuring that this resource remains freely available to all who seek it. Visit insightmyanmar.org/donation to make a contribution.
Bodhava Yaranangaya Unyana Dadu Yadananda Ganizadamana, we got a Besayana, Besayo. Oba Yarananda Dayananga Yaranaya Dayanam Bodhava Yaranam